You're 15 and the town tells you have to get married to a 29-year-old because the ghost in the basement said so. Unfortunately, that's what happened to a girl named Lydia back in the 1800s in Maine. This originally started with her dad hearing knocking noises in their cellar. He lights his lantern and makes his way into the cellar. No one's there. This goes on for a few nights, and then finally the knocking turns into the presence of a woman. She tells the man that her name is Lily and that she's the late wife of a man by the name of George that lives just 6 miles up the road. She then continues to tell the man how she is showing herself because she believes that the 15-year-old Lydia needs to marry the man. He's confused at first. He doesn't believe it. She tells him, "I'm real. This is really happening. You can bring anyone down here if you want, and I'll tell them the same." At one point, over 30 people were in the basement to witness the woman talking about Lydia marrying her husband, George. It was actually documented that George finally entered the cellar and the ghost told him things that no one would know except for his late wife, Lily. That was enough to convince the town that Lydia should marry George, regardless if Lydia wanted to or not. But then Lily's like, "Oh yeah, one more thing. You're going to pass away within the year." And 10 months later, Lydia had a child and both passed away. Was Lily really a ghost or something else? Check out my podcast to hear even more about this story.
True Thanksgiving horror stories from Unable Anago. My mom's friend at the time when I was 14 worked for the governor's office of Pennsylvania. We went to her house for Thanksgiving that year, and her house was built in the 1700s. As soon as we get there, you can hear footsteps and doors slamming upstairs. Come to find out later, we're the only people there. Throughout the night, people were poked and hair was pulled by a little ghost girl. I even had a mean dad ghost whisper, "Get out of my house." Dinner, it was kind of wild. Someone's hair got flicked. I left that dinner, and I refused to go back inside. Mom got real mad. The end.
Do something with it.
It's just money coming to me easily. Money coming in and needing me. Money coming in repeatedly. Money coming, it's just money coming. It's just money coming to me frequently. Money coming in to be with me. Money coming in secretly. Money coming, it's just money coming. It's just money coming to me easily.
The Brazilian vampire, Camille Monfort. Yeah, I butchered that. We're going to call her Camille, but here's her real name. But you guys are not going to believe this because you know who she looks exactly like. This girl, my daughter, Kata. I know, twins. But let's talk about her for a minute. Belém, Brazil was starting to get popular because of rubber trade. All of the wealthy were coming there. They were importing all of their stuff from all over the world. And then they started getting big into theater. Which brings us to this beauty. She came from France. She was an opera singer. Men loved her and the women hated her. Jealousy. And apparently she was super fun too. She was known for wandering up and down the river wearing like nothing, dancing in the moonlight, living her best life. But then they were like, why is she so pale? You know who else is pale? Kata! Then the rumor got started that while she was in London, she got afflicted with vampirism. The locals were like, that makes sense, that makes sense. They said she had this thirst for what all vampires need, and she had the perfect way to get it. Apparently, she would sing and then hypnotize, mesmerize all of the women to where they would faint, and then she'd pounce on them and get what she needed. Wealthy men were taking her in and bathing her in champagne. Tragically, she ended up getting cholera and passing away, but was she a vampire? Are they just jealous? One thing we can agree on, she looks exactly like Kata.
When Sam downloaded a new music app, he was intrigued by its promise of personalized playlists. The app offered to create a playlist based on his mood and preferences. Excited, he set it up and was eager to listen to his new mix. As Sam started listening to the playlist, he noticed that the songs were unusual. They had eerie, haunting melodies and disturbing lyrics that seemed to change every time he played them. The music made him feel uneasy, but he couldn't stop listening. The playlist began to include tracks with unsettling, whispered voices that seemed to speak directly to Sam. The voices whispered his name and recounted personal details about his life that he had never shared with anyone. He felt a growing sense of dread as the music grew more disturbing. The last track on the playlist was labeled Goodbye. As Sam listened, he heard a chilling message. "We're closer than you think." The music abruptly stopped, and the app closed itself. Sam felt an overwhelming sense of terror, realizing that something far more sinister was behind the app.
This happened in Tlalnepantla in el Estado de Mexico. And if I said that wrong, don't even tell me because it's taken me a long time just with this intro. So this guy was looking for a job and his friend actually offered him one and they were working for the morgue. They were the ones who would go to like scenes of the crimes, get the bodies, and transfer them over to the morgue. It was the 1st of November, close to 2 in the morning. They got a call to go to a house, and when they arrived, the police were there. Unfortunately, a man had ended the lives of his wife and daughter. He waited for the people to put the bodies in his van, and then he transferred them back to the morgue. He says that his shift was supposed to end at 7 in the morning, but the person actually called in, so he was gonna have to do a whole nother shift. He took a little break and he was outside talking with the security guard of the building, and that was when the little girl dressed as a witch came up to them and asked them for help. He says that the little girl said, "Please, please come help me, they're killing my mom." The security guard immediately took out his pew-pew and told him to take the little girl to the coolers, as that was the safest spot for her to be in the moment. He says that he carried the little girl, took her to that room and told her to stay put, and he also locked the door behind him, so he locked the little girl in there for safety. After leaving the girl in the room, he said he ran outside to help the security guard just in case there was somebody trying to harm the little girl's mom. When he caught up to the security guard told him that there was nobody outside, but that he still called the police just in case there was somebody in the area. When the police got there, they did tell the police that the little girl was in the cooler because of what she had told them, and they did end up taking the police towards the coolers where they had left that little girl. When he unlocked the door and opened it, there was nobody in the room. The cops ended up laughing and making fun of the guy and the security guard, and they're like, "Did Halloween really affect you guys this much?" He said that day he didn't even leave work until 9 p.m. so he ended up working 3 shifts in a row. The following day he went into his shift, and as soon as he got into work, someone told him that the security guard was in really bad shape, like he was sick or something. So obviously he wanted to go see if he was okay, and when he went to go see him, the security guard immediately tells him, "Hey, we found the little girl." He told him that the little girl was one of the bodies they had picked up on November 1st at 2 in the morning. He couldn't believe what the security guard was telling him, so he was like, "No, and by the way, we have cameras here. Let's go look at the cameras because I don't believe you. This little girl is not dead. It's not the same little girl we picked up." To his surprise, in the video, it shows him almost picking something up, but there was no little girl. It was almost as if he had picked up something imaginary and ran to the coolers. In that very moment, he quit his job. I would too, because imagine if that should happen. Oh my god, if that should happen all the time. No, especially that he had like video proof. I feel like a lot of people don't get that, but the fact that he saw himself pick up something that wasn't there and he knew he had picked up that little girl, no thank you.
True Thanksgiving horror stories from Killer Orange Cat. When I was 15, we had Thanksgiving dinner early at my grandparents' that year, about 2 p.m. Afterwards, I was beginning to feel a bit antsy, and I let my parents know that I was going to go explore the Hollow for a little bit. It'd been a while since I'd done so, and I didn't even think about asking my younger brother and sister if they wanted to go. After all, I like being by myself. I knew that I didn't have a lot of time to explore before it got dark, so I set out to make sure that I knew how far I could go and get back before the sun had set. I didn't do the greatest job at it, though. If you've ever been out exploring the woods, you probably know what I mean. You can easily get fascinated by the hills and the woods and lose track of time. And it got very, very dark before I got anywhere close to being back to the house. By the time I got back to the farm, it had been dark for at least an hour. I'd never been out by the barn when it was dark outside, and it looked incredibly creepy. Me being a teenage boy, I love creepy stuff. And a thought occurred to me that if the barn's creepy on the outside, it's got to be way creepier on the inside. So I decided to go explore it. Getting into the barn was simple. My grandparents rarely locked their door, let alone lock that barn. They lived in a really, really safe area where crime was pretty much unheard of. And the barn did have one of those really heavy wooden locks on it. I don't know what those are called, but I was able to pull up the wooden beam, and when I opened the door, it made a horrible creaking noise. I knew my grandparents had likely not been in that barn for years, so I was surprised I was even able to get the door open at all. I figured the hinges would just be rusted shut. As I mentioned, the barn was really old, and they never really used it that much, and if they did use it, it was during the daytime because the barn didn't have any lights in it. But thank God we lived in an era of smartphones, so I had a light on my phone. I turned my flashlight on and just marveled at the creepiness. If dark is creepy, then just a minor amount of light will make it much more creepier. I was fascinated by all the tools and so many sharp implements, most of which were hanging up. However, there was a small hatchet laying on the workbench. It was discolored, and on close inspection, I realized that it was coated in dried blood. I don't know much about slaughter animals, but I knew that my grandparents used to do it often. Chickens and pigs and stuff. So I just figured the hatchet was used for that purpose and they just never cleaned it off. The barn had a lot of hay up in the loft too, so I decided to climb the ladder and check it out. When I was shining my light around, it reflected off something buried in the hay, and I was wondering if there was another tool or something there, so I went to go check that out too. Going up over it, I began to move the hay, and I screamed when the empty eye sockets of a long, dead corpse were staring directly at me. I nearly fell backwards off the loft, and I quickly climbed down the ladder and ran back to the house to tell my grandparents and parents what I found. My father, who's a huge man, like Hulk Hogan size, went out to go check it out, and he confirmed it. My grandparents phoned the sheriff's office. The body apparently had been in the loft for about 3 years. It had several hatchet wounds on it, and the police told us that the cause of the hatchet wounds was that hatchet that I found on that bench. Which means I not only found a dead body, but I also handled the murder weapon. But it wasn't nearly as disturbing as the realization that my grandparents had lived in that house for 3 years and knew nothing about a dead body being in their barn. They also never solved the mystery of who it was or how it happened. The end.
So let's just get straight to the animation. I lived alone in an apartment with my pet Doberman Toby. I had moved away from my parents' place ever since I got a full-time job as an IT tech. Thanksgiving was just around the corner, and I had planned to stay by my parents' place for a few days after months of being away. However, although I was looking forward to it, one thing made me anxious: my mother. Being the eldest son who was still single, the task of caring for the woman who raised me was entrusted to me, since she was now suffering from dementia. One moment she'd be on cloud 9, and then all of a sudden she'd be acting out of pocket like the girl possessed from the Exorcist movie. And if that wasn't creepy enough, I even saw her in the living room once talking to herself, laughing and crying simultaneously as she stabbed one of our family portraits displayed on the table with a kitchen knife.
He's not part of the family! He's not part of the family! He's not part of the family!
I had no idea what she was talking about, but after seeing a lot of videos online, everything was leading back to dementia. I didn't know how to respond to the situation, afraid she'd be ridiculed if friends or relatives dropped by the house. However, I vividly remember one of the videos talking about the ability of animals being able to alleviate the suffering of people diagnosed with chronic ailments. So that's when I stopped by the house with Toby one day and was greeted by my mother at the front door. She stared at me for quite a while, making me uneasy. So to withdraw from this awkward situation, I gently pulled my dog by the leash, thinking I should bring him inside the house. However, to my surprise, my mother gripped my other hand ever so tightly, saying,
Get rid of that rodent! You understand me? I don't feel good around that dog!
I replied, Mom, it's just Toby. He used to live in this house before, remember? I took him away when I moved out. Can you at least try to remember that? However, she frowned upon me, mistaking it for disrespect.
How dare you! You're in no position to defy me!
Mom, if I'm coming over for Thanksgiving, then so is
To
Toby.
hell with that dog! You only want him for yourself. You can't fool me!
People around me would always talk about patience, reminding me that her behavior was simply the result of her ongoing condition. But there's a limit to everything. Once the cup is full, everything would fall into disarray. Frustrated, I shouted, No, he's not going anywhere! You're the reason why I wanted to move out! Frightened, Toby ceased to wag his tail, slowly hiding behind my legs, and at that moment, I saw my mother's eyes brimming with hate. Then, seconds later, her mood changed again, as she smiled and said,
All right, we'll have it your way. Come in, little boy. Who's a good boy? Yes, you are.
She caressed Toby's head and brought him inside, as I stood there delirious, and nothing out of the ordinary transpired in the days that followed. However, just when I thought she had gotten closer to Toby, I heard her hollering in the dining room one night. I got up to check on her and saw that she was distraught by all the broken plates scattered on the floor. Then, as soon as she saw me, she yanked me by the collar and said,
Donate this dog. Give him away or leave him in the forest. I don't care. Just get Get rid of him!
I didn't know what to make of it, since Toby was well behaved the entire time. For all I know, my mother could have been the one responsible for all the broken plates, coercing me to cave in. I ended up getting a broom and sweeping the sharp pieces of glass away, while I saw my mother scamper to her room, leaving me to clean up the mess. I figured I'd bring Toby around the next time we had dinner, in hopes that if she saw my father around Toby, then maybe she'd eventually warm up to him. One night, I went into the kitchen to get myself a glass of water, and could hear my mother's voice in the living room talking to our dog. I didn't want to frighten her, and so I gradually walked toward the room and took a peek.
It'll all be over soon, you rodent. You don't belong here. My son's right. It's no use giving you away. That wouldn't suffice. What we need is a permanent solution. It's time to give thanks.
Toby barked in a tone that would imply he was threatened, and for the past couple of weeks, the only time he was ever anxious was whenever my mother was around. So, as most people would do, it would have been reasonable to have kept the dog next to me at all times. However, seeing that she never inflicted physical harm on the dog, I felt that there was no need to intervene, and that ignoring her would be the best course of action. She was indeed known for her bad temper. However, I never saw her as someone who could take the life of a living creature. The night before Thanksgiving, my father finally arrived home from his long business trip, and when I suggested buying dinner for us, he immediately gave me the thumbs up. However, it was different for my mother though. Enraged, she kept raving about how she was the woman of the house, and that she was the only one responsible for preparing the meals at home. My father and I looked at each other, puzzled and anxious. Finally, to avoid making matters any more awkward, we let her have her way due to her condition and persistence. The following day, I arrived home from a quick stroll at the grocery store to pick up some sides for the Thanksgiving dinner with my parents. I remember seeing my mother placing a massive platter with a silver lid on the table. Crawling its way from the kitchen, the aroma was enticing and irresistible. My father and I couldn't wait to dig in. However, as soon as my mother lifted the silver lid, our jaws dropped, and my father stood in horror at the sight of something that was definitely not a turkey. She glanced at my father and me, saying,
I thought of being more creative this year, so bon appetit!
and just like that, Toby went from an adorable pet to a nauseating dinner that would leave me traumatized forever. Ah!
It was Black Friday 2013, and I decided to be one of those people who gets up at 3 a.m. to get some early deals. Home Depot was having crazy deals on artificial Christmas trees, so I wanted to get there early and buy one for my family. They opened their doors at 3 a.m. on the spot, 3 hours earlier than usual for Black Friday. Surprisingly, only me and one other guy were waiting to get in. I guess everyone else was at Best Buy or the mall. I found a nice 9-foot-tall artificial Christmas tree, originally for $200, but at that moment half off for only $100. I asked one of the few employees working at that hour to help me carry the box to the checkout and then to my car. The parking lot was still surprisingly empty for Black Friday. I figured maybe I didn't have to come so early. I tipped the guy and got in my car ready to leave when someone knocked on my window. I lowered the window, and some guy, mid-20s, beanie, black, and tall, leaned into my window asking if I had change. I opened the little compartment in between seats where I normally keep change, and it was actually empty. I didn't want to have to hand him a 10, so I said, "Nah, man, sorry." He looked disappointed, and I actually felt bad. He then asked me if I could give him a lift to the nearest gas station. I was a bit nervous about letting a stranger in my car, but guess what? I let him in. He did not thank me, which kind of hurt, I guess because I'm a little sensitive. I asked him if he knew of any close-by gas stations. He just said, "Nah." A few seconds later, I asked him why he needed to go to a gas station, and I swear to God, he didn't answer. It's not like he didn't hear me. He just flat out ignored me. I stopped looking at him at that point because I was feeling a bit uncomfortable now. I kept driving down main and side roads, but there was no goddamn gas stations anywhere. I was trying not to look in his direction, but I could tell he was staring at me. Every turn I made, every stop sign I stopped at, he was staring at me. I was sweating now. This guy was freaking me out. I felt like at any moment he could just grab my throat and I'd be done for. At last, I could see a gas station just beyond a light which had just turned red. Why did it have to turn red just now? I thought to myself. I could still feel his stare, even as I looked the other way. I finally decided to sum up the balls and looked at him. I felt his cold, emotionless stare run straight through my eyes into my soul. Are you okay? I asked him. He ever so slightly nodded his head, almost not even noticeable. The light turned green, and I pulled into the gas station. He stepped out and stood by the sidewalk and watched me as I pulled away. When I got past the intersection, I laughed out of joy and the ridiculousness of the situation. But then I realized something. I patted myself down and then began to panic. I was missing something. My phone. I was only a few blocks away, so I made a U-turn and headed back to the gas station. He was gone already. I drove home and confirmed that my phone was missing. I knew I had left it in the cup holder of my car. My phone had all of my info on it. I contemplated calling the police, but I didn't. I couldn't even sleep that night in fear of some freak stranger having my address. The next night, after getting home from our 2-day delayed Thanksgiving dinner, I found my front door was open and my entire house was trashed. I called the police with my neighbor's phone. They didn't find him in there, but they found his prints everywhere. The only thing, the prints did not match anyone on record.
So today we're going to talk about Thanksgiving horror stories. I actually found this story on Reddit, so I'm just going to share. So one Thanksgiving day, a family was gathered together just preparing the food in the kitchen and enjoying time together. The whole time, the grandmother had been sitting quietly in the recliner, not really saying anything to anyone. A couple hours later, dinner was ready, so the whole family got ready to go into the dining room, except for Grandma. Someone went back to help Grandma, thinking that maybe she was having trouble getting out of the chair, when they realized that she had actually passed away. While everyone had been sitting around laughing and making jokes and cooking and having a great time, she had passed away in that recliner. They ended up calling an ambulance, but at this point, she had been gone for a while. 2 of the family members left with Grandma in the ambulance, or Grandma's body in the ambulance, while the rest of the family stayed back and had a very awkward dinner, just staring at each other, not really saying much.
It was a rainy Thanksgiving. We have a small family, so our family gatherings are tiny. It was my mom, my 2 sisters, our grandparents, and I for dinner at my mom's house. My older sister Nancy has been moved out for years. My younger sister Jamie and I still live at home with our mom. Our grandparents live 20 minutes away. Our dad's side of the family all live in a different town. We were all helping out with cooking and such, and our grandma was bringing over some food as well. We always do Thanksgiving dinner at 6 o'clock sharp. Our grandparents arrived at like 5 o'clock. We had to go out and help them walk through the rain up the front stoop to make sure they didn't slip. It was really bad out. Once they were here, we put the football game on in the living room, and I sat with my grandparents and watched football with my grandpa, who's a big Cowboys fan. My sisters were in the kitchen helping my mom with the food. The rainstorm created for a more comfortable and relaxing Thanksgiving evening. That is, at first. When it was time to set the table, I went to help. We were all at the table by 6 o'clock as per the usual. We had a giant selection of food for the small amount of people we were. Turkey, leg of lamb, potatoes, stuffing, corn, cranberry sauce, cornbread, and more food I'm probably forgetting. We were all at the table eating, drinking wine, and talking before we migrated to the living room, where there we all watched the football game. Then, sometime before the game ended, the doorbell rang. It was still pouring outside, and we weren't expecting anyone else. Our mom said, "Oh no, what if that's your father?" Long story short, our parents don't speak, but the idea of our father coming to surprise us wasn't impossible. My mom told me to go check who it was, so I went to the door and yelled through it, "Who is it?" But the sound of the pouring rain on the front awning drowned out the sound of a male's voice on the other side. So I opened the door, with the storm door still closed and locked. There was a black man on the other side of the door. He was in some really big rain jacket with the hood up. When I opened the door, he walked closer and yelled something through the door. I had to ask him to repeat it twice before I understood him to be asking for food, saying he's hungry. Then he said something along the lines of, "The Lord will give you good karma if you spare some food." I said, "1 second." I went to the living room and told my mom there's a possible homeless or just very hungry man asking for food at the front door. My mom said close the door, while my grandma said give him some food. I said I'll make a little paper plate of food for him from the leftovers. I went to the kitchen, grabbed a bunch of paper plates to account for the rain outside ruining them, and then sandwiched some of the leftovers together with them. Then I went to the front door where the guy was still standing. I held up the plate to show him, and he tried opening the door. I yelled, "Wait, it's locked." But I already was wary now after he tried opening the door. Regrettably, I still unlocked the door, and the second I started to push it open, he pulled it open with force and tried pushing his way through me. I instantly threw the food and held him back, yelling for my sisters to come help me. As Nancy came to help shut the door, I saw 2 more guys rushing up the front walkway to the door. I managed to push the man out enough to clear the door, and I helped my sister slam it shut. The second it was locked, I ran to the backyard door to make sure it was locked. I was the only able-bodied man in the house, and I felt like it was on me to protect the house. My family was in hysterics as we were brainstorming what to do. Not so shockingly, we settled for calling the police. My mom called while I kept going from window to window looking outside. It was hard to see out through the pouring rain, but through the backyard window, I saw a couple men running through the grass to the back door. I'd imagine they tried opening the back door and failed, and then I saw them running through the grass again back to the gate. Then they were gone. When the police got here, the food that I dropped onto the front stoop was still just sitting there, all scattered on the porch. Not that it wasn't obvious that those guys didn't come for the food, but it's something worth mentioning. Our Thanksgiving was almost turned into a complete nightmare if it weren't for my and my sister's quick reactions. I know my grandma had her heart in the right place, wanting to help the seemingly needy, and I was influenced by her. But unfortunately, we live in a world where sometimes trying to do the right thing could bite you in the ass. We installed the doorbell camera soon after this.
After turning 18, I barely spoke to my family because of how strange they were. I mainly just spent the holidays by myself or with friends. It was lonely, but it was better than being with my extremely strange relatives. I can't explain why, but being around them just made me sick to my stomach. When a letter arrived on my doorstep, I was unpleasantly surprised to see it was from my family. I opened the letter up and read it. It was an invite to my grandfather's funeral on Thanksgiving. He was one of the few people in the family who treated me kindly, so I decided to pay my respects. I also knew I would have no one to spend Thanksgiving with, because my roommate hadn't been home in days. The invitation also mentioned to bring a side dish for dinner, so I stayed up all night cooking one of my favorite soups. After work that day, I packed all my things up and got ready to spend the night at a hotel. It was a long and silent 4-hour drive, but I didn't mind it. The funeral was held at my grandpa's home. I didn't question it. It was probably a special request of his before passing, or a weird decision my family had come up with. I arrived at my late grandpa's house. I was unsurprisingly greeted coldly by my family. I assumed they didn't take it well that I hadn't seen them for the past 5 years. I brushed them off. I was here for my grandfather and no one else. I set my soup onto the table, and then chatted with some of my cousins that I hadn't seen in a while. I could feel how two-faced they were. They weren't actually concerned about how I was doing, or if my life turned out the way I planned. They were just putting up an act with a pretty smile. No one in this family was normal. My grandfather's casket was located in the living room. It was a closed casket, but I still felt sad just looking at it. The sun slowly began setting, and my delusional aunt had come up with a Thanksgiving turkey. One thing caught my eye. The turkey was abnormally huge. Maybe I was just used to small ones because my friends and I couldn't afford big ones. But I wonder why they needed such a big turkey when our family could barely finish a normal-sized one. Everyone got a slice of turkey, along with some sides that everyone brought. All of my family members were complimenting me on my soup, to which I only replied with a smile. We sat around the table, talking about the best memories with Grandpa. I couldn't help but notice my delusional aunt grinning ear to ear as everyone spoke. She would glance at me every now and then, and give me an even bigger unnatural smile. In the middle of one of my uncles talking, a scream ran throughout the room. Everyone turned their heads to the source. One of my aunts had spit out a human eyeball into the ground. Everyone saw the source of where the eyeball was from. My soup. My other cousins started coughing, and all sorts of disfigured body parts poured out their mouths. Everyone was screaming in realization of what they had just eaten. All I did was give them a pretty smile. No one was normal in this family, including me.
Me and the girlfriend were on our way to her parents' house. I was invited to Thanksgiving dinner with them, which was a huge honor for me since I had only met her parents 3 times. I was also nervous since her grandparents and aunts and uncles would also be there who I had never met. We had a long trek from my house to her parents' house. It would be a good hour-long drive. About 45 minutes into the drive, we had to stop for gas. We pulled up into a literally dead Gulf station right off the highway, and I decided to fill up with premium for once to do my car a favor. Of course, it was cheaper to pay with cash, so I went inside with my head down as I dug my hand inside my wallet searching for a 10 and a 20, and when I pulled the bills out, I instinctively looked up and said, 30 on 2 please. But I stopped mid-sentence. there was no one there. I looked for a bell on the counter. None. I simply called out, "Anyone there?" There wasn't even a back door behind the counter that you would assume would lead to some kind of employees-only room. No, it was just completely empty. The only other door in this little gas station besides the entrance was the single bathroom, and that door was open, exposing the blackness from within the bathroom. I figured maybe whoever was manning the cash register may have just gone outside for something. I walked back outside and shrugged my shoulders at my girlfriend out of confusion. I looked around for maybe a porta potty or an ice machine or something that could be distracting a potential cashier, but there was nothing. It was a relatively small little station with foliage surrounding it in almost all directions. I figured maybe somebody could be behind the building smoking a bogey or a doobie, so I went back there as a final attempt. Nope, just a dumpster sitting under a dimly lit roof light. Ugh, I figured I'd just pay credit at this point and turn it back. But as I did, somebody from out in the woods called over to me in a kind of whispery yell. My heart skipped a beat when I heard this. "Hey! Hey!" I kept hearing it from the woods. I took out my phone and flipped on the flashlight just to skim the outer tree line for anybody who could be hiding in there. As my now shaking hand rotated the phone slowly, the light momentarily revealed somebody from behind a tree. I took off back to the car and stepped on it out of there. My girlfriend was scared shitless just in reaction to my fear. I told her about the bizarre thing that just happened, and from that point on, she kept looking through the rearview mirrors just to make sure we weren't being followed. We pulled up to the next gas station we could find, this time one that actually had a cashier. I paid him $30 and began filling up. A van pulled up to the pump right behind mine, and a man wearing a cap stepped out staring intently at me. I tried to act as if I didn't notice him, but when it got to the point where he was staring at me for at least 20 seconds straight, I had to look at him and ask him if there was a problem. He finally turned away. The second I was done, I hopped back in the car and took off once more. We made it to her parents' house safely, and I don't believe we were followed. Now, I wouldn't have shared this story if it weren't for the fact that a few weeks later, I did some research and found out that a 33-year-old Indian man who worked at the gas station we had stopped at had been murdered and his body was stuffed in the woods behind the station. I immediately gave the police a tip about the guy who I saw at the station who was surely caught on camera. The following year on Thanksgiving, a similar murder happened at another gas station. We have since nicknamed him the Thanksgiving Killer. I fear only the worst once more this year, as he has still not been caught.
Thanksgiving was supposed to be a joyous occasion, but this year it felt different. My parents insisted we celebrate at my Uncle Walter's remote cabin in the woods, a place I hadn't visited since I was a kid. The memories I had of it were faint, but I recalled the oppressive silence of the forest and the way the trees seemed to loom over the cabin like watchful sentinels. We arrived late in the afternoon, the sun already dipping below the horizon. Uncle Walter greeted us at the door with his signature crooked grin, but something about him seemed off. His eyes darted nervously toward the woods behind us as he ushered us inside. The cabin hadn't changed much. The same old plaid couches, the same crackling fireplace, and the faint smell of damp wood and something metallic. Dinner was already on the table. Turkey, stuffing, mashed potatoes, and a pie that smelled overwhelmingly sweet. My mother complimented Walter on the spread, but I noticed he didn't eat. He just sat there, watching us with that unnerving grin. Halfway through the meal, the power went out. The cabin plunged into darkness, save for the flicker of the fire. Walter stood abruptly, muttering something about the generator. He grabbed a flashlight and disappeared outside, leaving us in uneasy silence. Minutes passed, then an hour. My dad went to check on him but didn't come back. I tried calling out, but the forest swallowed my voice. My mother's face was pale, her hand gripping mine tightly. Then we heard a scratching at the windows, followed by the creak of the front door. I froze, staring as the door swung open slowly. But it wasn't Uncle Walter or my dad. It was of them, shadowy figures with hollow eyes, their mouths stretched impossibly wide. They stepped inside, their movements jerky and unnatural, and I understood then what Uncle Walter's grin had been hiding. The forest wasn't just watching, it was hungry. And this Thanksgiving, we were the feast.
As I'm sitting here trying to find another horror Thanksgiving story to share with you guys, I actually remembered one that happened while I worked at the hospital. As most of you guys know, I used to work at a trauma center, which is where a lot of my earlier stories come from, because being around so much death and just so much sadness, you do experience a lot. This story took place on Thanksgiving night. I was working a 6:30 p.m. to 7 a.m. shift. At about 8 p.m. we get a trauma that comes in. It was a young girl, probably about 17 to 18 years old. She unfortunately did not make it. So the story goes, she had spent Thanksgiving with her mom, her mom's boyfriend, and the rest of the family. It was the end of the night and everybody was packing up all the leftovers and just kind of putting things away. The girl was sitting there cutting up the turkey and putting it in like containers to put in the fridge, when her mom and her mom's boyfriend got into a heated argument. The girl, of course, being that it was her mom, gets in between of it and wants to defend her mom and get this boyfriend to leave her mom alone. The argument escalates and the mom's boyfriend pulls out and shoots the girl point blank. They call 911, they get her to the hospital, but as you guys know, she did not make it. But this is the part that I'll never forget. When they brought the girl in, she had a big chunk of like turkey in her hand. She passed away gripping this chunk of turkey, being that she was in the process of cutting up turkey when she passed away.
I can't believe what I just discovered. Every Thanksgiving, Grandma Louise made her special gravy, shooing everyone out of the kitchen. This year, she's gone, leaving her granddaughter Elena with her leather-bound recipe book. On the last page, in what looks like dried blood, it reads, "For the perfect gravy, add a piece of everyone you've loved and lost. Their essence makes the flavor whole." Elena thought it was a metaphor, but in Louise's cellar, she found jars labeled with family members' names, all coinciding with previous Thanksgivings. What dark secret was Grandma hiding?
The Pere Cheney Cemetery is in Michigan and said to be haunted by a witch. But is it? Pere Cheney was a town in Michigan that was founded in the late 1800s. Everything was going great. They put up all of these buildings. The town was prospering. There was at least 1,500 members of the town. Until tragedy struck. Diphtheria ended up running rampant through the town, wiping out the majority of them, 90 of which were buried in this cemetery. Right after that, there was a massive fire, and then after that, diphtheria came back again, leaving the town with only 25 people. Many believe that the local towns started the fire to keep the spread of diphtheria contained, and some people believe that a witch did it. Now it's said that a witch haunts this cemetery. People have been there and claim to have seen her. They say that she was taken out into the woods and then later found by the townspeople and hanged from a tree near the cemetery. Now it's said that if you come back to your car after investigating near the abandoned town, you'll find little handprints, like child handprints, all over your vehicle. They even claim that you can see the witch wandering around the cemetery. Have you been? Have you seen the witch? Have you encountered the tiny handprints? Let me know in the comments.